Big Ten fans, Indiana, Ohio State, Michigan, USC, Nebraska, anywhere in the Big Ten, folks that we've talked with, games that we've broken down, we do a lot of things that are analysis or projecting or looking back at a game that has happened. And all of that is great. And it's really what we built the channel around. But today we're just going to have some fun. And hopefully, since the season is over and the off season is long and boring, you guys are down to just have some fun. I'm sure you recently saw Paul Finebaum's apology, his admission, his crow eating over the last few days after the Big Ten, and Indiana specifically, just won the conference's third straight national championship. A third straight championship game that didn't include an SEC opponent. And we've had a lot of thoughts on where the SEC is as a conference. And we've talked about talent, we've talked about coaching, and we've talked about, has this conference overtaken the other one? And I'll try not to spend just an exorbitant amount of time on those things, and we'll just try and get to part of the fun. I'll play Finebaum's apology here in just a few minutes, but he did eat some crow, and I'll give him some credit for that. However, the things he said over the last couple of years cannot be ignored. And I want to take you back to December of 2024. 13 months ago, when Indiana lost a close game. Now, let's be fair, a largely non-competitive for three-quarters game to Notre Dame, but lost a close game. In fact, it was the closest game on that opening weekend of college football. And I want to remind you what he said was his biggest takeaway after Indiana lost that game.
Well, it obviously helped to be at home, but it would have been a lot better if we had some real teams playing in the playoffs as opposed to a couple of frauds. And that's the disappointing part, Matt. And I know it sounds a little bit like crying over spilled milk, but the committee did a lousy job. And we as college football fans paid for it Friday night and all day Saturday. And I know the worst loss was Tennessee, but Tennessee did something to get into the playoffs. Indiana did nothing. SMU did nothing. And that's really what my biggest beef is on this Sunday.
So after watching Tennessee get blown out by an eventual champion, Ohio State, his biggest gripe was that SMU and current champion Indiana were frauds. Why? Because Indiana lost to two teams that they played, two teams that ended up being in the national championship game, and two pretty dang good teams. In fact, those are Indiana's only two losses the last 2 years, the entire Curt Cignetti tenure there. And so instead of saying, well, yeah, I know that Tennessee just got blown out and they were the most embarrassing team in the first round of the college football playoff in 2024, he wanted to call Indiana frauds. Well, you look at 2025's playoff and you think about what SEC teams did there. Was he calling Alabama a fraud? Did he call Oklahoma a fraud for losing to that team? Was Ole Miss a fraud because all they beat was Tulane, another SEC team, and then lost to Miami, and a lowly ACC team? The standard just doesn't hold up. And so when you start your premise on Indiana as a fraud, of course, everything he would say for the next year until he eventually had to eat crow was framed with that guideline. That's the way that he viewed Indiana. And it framed everything he would say in every clip that I'll play you today from that December 2024 clip until finally the one here in January of 26 where he did have to eat that crow. Now, very quickly, I want to show you a couple more clips because they just get better. But if you're watching this, we don't have fun like this all the time, but we do occasionally like to poke some fun and enjoy the off season. So hit the subscribe button, help us get over that 1,000 mark, which we're about 70 away from at this moment. And then we'll get back to real football talk here soon. All right, let's watch his next clip. This might be my favorite one of the bunch.
I think Indiana is very dominating. They're extremely good, but they won that big game against Oregon. And I'd like to see Indiana go through the gauntlet that Alabama has gone through in the last 5 weeks. They would not be undefeated.
Not be undefeated had they gone through the gauntlet that Alabama had gone through the last 5 weeks. What's great about this one is, are we sure about that? Have you seen that meme? Are you sure about that? Because that's what I would say to Finebaum. Now, that sounded good back in October, November. That sounded good when we were winning hypothetical games. But had Indiana gone through the gauntlet that Alabama had gone through, would they still be undefeated? I don't know. Let's think about what that gauntlet was. The game in Athens, very tough. Am I confident that Indiana would have won that game? No doubts about it. I'll say this. No, I'm not. I'm not 1,000% confident that Indiana would have won that game. I think they would have been in it. I saw them go to Eugene and find a win. I saw them win some really tough games against better teams than Ohio State this year. And I saw them, or than UGA this year. I saw them beat an Ohio State team at a neutral site. I saw them win at Oregon. I saw them win in Hard Rock Stadium. And so I'm not saying that they would have absolutely beat Georgia, but I think they certainly would have had a chance. And knowing what we know now, they probably would have had a pretty good chance. What was the rest of that gauntlet? Well, it included a Missouri team that doesn't have a win over a team that finished above 500 in the SEC. Actually, Drinkowitz has never done that. So I don't like them against Missouri. What about the Vandy team? I certainly think Pavia would have had some big plays in that game, maybe made some things happen, but I don't think Vandy would have been the team that would have knocked off Indiana. What about Tennessee? Didn't beat a team with a winning record this year. That looked like a good win for Alabama at the time, but I don't think that was a great win. What about LSU, who was in there? LSU fired their coach. I don't know that that was a gauntlet type game, and I certainly would have taken Indiana. So at worst, maybe Indiana goes 4-1 in that stretch, but probably goes 5-0, especially, and I know you can't use the transitive property, but especially once you saw what Indiana did to Alabama and how much better they were than them. This idea that Alabama just is the undefeated world beaters of the world because they played a tough schedule on paper didn't really come out to be the truth. And the ultimate irony is, again, what Indiana did to Alabama once they got to the playoff. Here's the next one.
Welcome to the show. Did Indiana make the right move with Cignetti?
They did not. And before anybody jumps out of their chair, allow me to explain. I think everyone on this panel agrees that he's done a phenomenal job. But Stephen A., this is how programs get in trouble. They just gave him an extension and a contract raise at the end of last season. We are barely at the midpoint. Let it play out before you completely send the Brinks truck up. Listen, there are very few generational talent. I understand why ESPN spends a fortune, like $100 million, to keep a once-in-a-lifetime talent like Steven. Curt Cignetti is one of the top coaches in America. He has coached brilliantly this year, but can't you let it play out a little bit? He has one big win, maybe one and a half, including the win a couple weeks ago over Illinois. And by the way, because Indiana is going to be in the playoffs, there's no way he could leave anytime before December or January.
So a couple of things with that one. Yes, I understand what he's saying. Maybe play the wait and see game. Everything he said got proven wrong. From that Indiana maybe didn't know what they had. I think we all knew what Indiana had. We just weren't ready to admit it yet. We weren't ready to admit that a team could turn it around like Indiana has. We weren't ready to admit that a coach could take a program that is a historical loser and turn them into the best college football story of our lifetimes. The funniest part of it, as a guy who shills for and covers the SEC, is he said, why would you make him this raise now? It's not like he could leave you in the middle of a playoff run. What's been the biggest story in the SEC for the last 2 months? It's Lane Kiffin. It's the fact that a coach left for a more premier job, and this is no slight to Indiana fans, but there are more premier jobs in this country than Indiana. That's just the truth of the matter. I met some Indiana fans at a theme park here in Florida 2 days before the national championship, and we talked about this. And so to think that a coach, just because he's on a college football playoff run, would not leave for a better opportunity is ludicrous, because we just saw that happen with the biggest story in college football this season, being Lane Kiffin, something that happened in Paul's own backyard, going from Ole Miss to LSU and spurning a playoff team, a team that was a play away from being in the national championship game. It wasn't an Ole Miss team that just skated in. It wasn't an Ole Miss team that had no chance. It was an Ole Miss team that barely lost to Georgia and Athens and then beat everybody else on their schedule until they ran into Miami. The idea that Indiana should have slowed down and not pushed the accelerator on this is just more of him doubling down on the idea that ultimately Indiana's frauds and everything they do is wrong. They should have pumped the brakes here. He would never leave in the middle of a playoff run. Yeah, Paul, because we've never seen that happen before. I understand that 2 of them were group of 5 teams, but 3 coaches in this college football playoff were already signed with new programs by the time that their playoff games were happening. Tulane, JMU, and Ole Miss. Thinking that Indiana couldn't have gotten robbed blind of their head coach had they not stepped up and offered him a massive extension is ludicrous. However, if Ole Miss would have done this, if Ole Miss would have gotten Lane to sign a $120 million contract to stay in Oxford, he would have praised that as a great move by the Ole Miss staff. Great job keeping him away from LSU. Because here's why. Because LSU was a tangible threat to Ole Miss. Now, obviously, he ended up choosing LSU. What if Ohio State would have been poking around Curt Cignetti? What if Notre Dame would have been poking around Curt Cignetti? And there was that tangible threat. Would then Indiana have been smart for retaining him? Well, let me let you know how things work. Programs were poking around for Curt Cignetti. They absolutely wanted him, whether it be Michigan or Penn State or whomever. Programs wanted him, and Indiana locked him down, and Finebaum, being the hater that he is, couldn't stand that. He wanted the Indiana model to still fit into the fraud idea that he had of them. And that's why he said it. Here's another one.
A cute story, but it will get some attention on Tuesday morning, Matt, but it really won't get that much because it's all about what's next in the NFC and the AFC championship games.
Let's pivot off.
Again, just belittling Indiana's accomplishments. It's just a cute story. It's not going to have any lasting impact. It's not really that relevant. Meanwhile, he's still talking about the 2019 LSU team. He's talking about the 2020 Alabama team. He's talking about 21 Georgia. All those things are lasting forever. But what happened in this one? Again, objectively, I'm an FSU fan. I've got my favorite college football moments. Some of them include FSU. Some of them include that Texas USC game. Some of them include some Ohio State big championships. Listen, I hated Tebow when he was in school. Those were still fun as heck teams to root for. Objectively, the best story of our lifetimes, to Paul Finebaum, just a cute story. Nothing with any kind of staying power. Here's his apology.
There can be debate on whether Indiana had the best season in college football history, but there can be no debate. It is the greatest story in the history of the game. And what made it even more amazing is how people misunderstood what Curt Cignetti was doing in Bloomington. But let me assure you, nobody was more incorrect in understanding that process than me. Almost everything I said throughout the season about him and about Indiana was wrong, and it was an epic failure on my part. There was no question Indiana was the best team, and yes, the Big Ten is the best conference in the country. We congratulate Coach Cignetti, Indiana, and the Big Ten for an extraordinary run.
You can hear the brokenness in his voice. Now, as much fun as we poked at him, he did own up to it. I don't know if he owned up to it in his 56-second rant quite as much as he dogged Indiana for the last year and a half, but I will say at least he owned up to it. The brokenness in his voice, in his spirit of having to admit that the SEC has been passed by the Big Ten. And I know there's some out there, Boog McFarland and others, that'll still cap for the SEC. Listen, the SEC is still a really good conference. I'm not telling you that they're behind the American or the ACC or anything like that. But the brokenness in his voice of having to admit, I was wrong about everything. I was wrong when I called them frauds. I was wrong when I talked about Cignetti them should not have signed him to the deal they did at the time they did. I was wrong when I talked about Bama's gauntlet. I was wrong when I said the SEC would finally take him out. I was wrong when I said it would be a cute story. Listen, he just said one of the greatest stories we've ever seen. The brokenness in him having to admit that. Like, Paul is pretty high energy. Like, I'm a high energy guy. I get that. Some people are high energy. Some people are like even keeled all the time. And that's fine. Paul's pretty high energy and gets things going and gets riled up at times, especially when the SEC is doing well. Go back and rewatch some of his stuff from the late 2010s and the early 2020 timeframe. Yeah, he was really riled up then. He sounded like you just kicked his puppy dog when he was recording that minute diatribe about being wrong. Now, I do think the SEC is still a good conference. There is no doubt the Big Ten has passed it. And it'll be interesting to see how the next few years go, because it doesn't feel like that dominant SEC team still exists. And what the Big Ten has done the last couple of years is have several dominant teams. Has the SEC watered itself down too much? Has the NIL transfer portal and land, all of that stuff? Yes, it has evened the playing field in a massive way. But where the SEC is really good on marketing and clicks and being sexy, the Big Ten does a good job of just putting belt to you-know-what and winning games. I don't know that necessarily changes, but I'll tell you, it is fun for those of us who have had to endure, and those of us who live here in the South, to endure the Paul Finebaums of the world for the last 20 plus years. It's nice hearing them eat a little bit of crow and being humbled just a bit. Just wanted to have some fun today. Again, if you enjoyed this, if you want more Big Ten updates, do me a favor and hit the subscribe button. We've got everything from Michigan, of course, more Indiana, Ohio State, USC, and other Penn State content coming your way very soon. So make sure that you are subscribed. Hopefully you enjoyed this. We'll talk to you soon here on Big Ten Football Addiction.